They always told us that self-love is repeating pretty phrases in the mirror, that all it takes is a smile at your reflection and everything will be resolved. But the truth is different. If the ego isn't at peace, if the persona continues to play roles to please, and if the shadow remains hidden, any criticism, any rejection, any silence will be enough to shatter that self-esteem. Carl Jung already demonstrated solid self-love isn't born from praise, but from the courage to delve into the unconscious and reconcile with every part of yourself. It's counterintuitive, but true. The more we seek external approval, the more fragile we become. The secret isn't in winning people's attention, but in learning to look at ourselves without a mask, without fear, without anesthesia. And when this love awakens, it becomes indestructible. Because no one can steal that which doesn't depend on anyone to exist. True self-love is a silent revolution. It's not shown in photos, but in the calm of someone who knows who they are, even in the midst of chaos. And that's exactly what you'll discover here. Step by step, through Jung's deep psychology, you'll understand how to build self-esteem that resists setbacks, isn't shaken by criticism, and rises in the shadows and flourishes in the light. This is the kind of knowledge few have the courage to apply, but it completely transforms the way we live, love, and exist in the world. How many times has someone felt confident until a criticism broke through their defenses and shattered everything? This is the problem with self-esteem based on external factors. It's fragile because it depends on validation. The ego loves to feed on praise, likes, and applause. But a disapproving look is all it takes for that security to crumble. Carl Jung would say that this kind of self-esteem is just a game of persona, the social mask trying to appear strong, while the true self remains vulnerable behind the scenes. It's like building a house on sand. No matter how beautiful it appears, any wave can knock it down. This fragility manifests itself in simple situations. A person who feels beautiful until they hear a negative comparison. Someone who considers themselves competent until they receive public criticism. Or even someone who feels loved only when they receive constant displays of affection. This type of self-esteem is conditional. It depends on external stimuli to exist. And the problem is that when we place our worth in the hands of others, we are handing over our souls on a silver platter. Spirituality invites us to look within and realize that true self-love is not measured by likes, salaries, or other people's approval. But don't think this reflection is merely theoretical. There are practical ways to recognize when your self-esteem is still stuck in this fragile state. Ask yourself, if no one praised me, would I still believe in my worth? If my achievements weren't seen, would I still be proud of them? These questions reveal where self-love is still external rather than internal. Shadow work in this case is essential, recognizing the parts of ourselves that still seek validation to feel worthy. Because only by facing this shadow can we begin to move towards solid self-esteem, one that doesn't waver in the wind. The persona, a term coined by Carl Jung, is the mask we all wear to survive in society. It's not necessarily negative. We need it to work, socialize, and be accepted in groups. But the problem begins when we confuse this mask with who we really are. The ego clings to the persona as if it were an absolute identity, and silent crises arise. Someone may appear confident, smiling, and fulfilled on the outside, but inside feel empty, disconnected, even lost. Spirituality reminds us that living only by the persona is living only on the surface, ignoring the depths of the soul. This conflict between social mask and true self is evident in everyday situations. The professional who is seen as an exemplary leader but cries alone at home because he can't handle the pressure. The popular person on social media who looks happy in every photo but suffers from a feeling of inadequacy that he never expresses. These contrasts show that without shadow work, the persona ends up suffocating the self. It's like wearing a costume every day until you forget what your own face looks like. And the result is an illusory self-esteem based on roles rather than essence. To begin to differentiate who we are from the mask we wear, a simple exercise is helpful. Write down in a notebook, "Who am I when no one is looking?" This practice can reveal fears, desires, and strengths that don't appear on the stage of the persona. The goal isn't to abandon the mask. It has a social function, but to prevent it from defining us. Solid self-love arises when a person can say, "I am not only what I show, I am also what I hide." And that's where the first step toward integrating the shadow and moving toward individuation comes. Carl Jung said that everything that bothers us in others is, in some way, a reflection of our own shadow. And this also applies to self-esteem. When we project our fears, insecurities, and weaknesses onto those around us, we end up reinforcing our feelings of inadequacy. The ego loves to point the finger. He's arrogant, she's insecure, they're cold. But most of the time, we're describing what we don't want to admit about ourselves. The persona steps in to disguise, feigning balance, while the shadow continues to control us from behind. These projections can silently erode self-esteem. Imagine someone who criticizes confident people, calling them arrogant. In truth, what bothers them is their own inability to sustain self-confidence. Or someone who judges people as too free, when deep down, they're envious of them for not having the courage to live authentically. Shadow work shows us that it's not by pointing outward that we free ourselves, but by recoiling from these projections and asking, "What does this say about me?" This simple gesture can become key in building true self-love because it restores our responsibility. In practice, a powerful exercise is to write down 3 people who arouse strong irritation or fascination and list the reasons. Then, reflect. How do these characteristics also live within me? This analysis may be uncomfortable, but it reveals forgotten talents and hidden pain. By integrating these aspects, we stop being hostage to comparisons and begin to strengthen our self-esteem by recognizing who we truly are, light and shadow. And it is at this point that we begin to realize solid self-love is not about eliminating flaws, but about integrating wholeness. For Jung, individuation was the most profound process of psychic life, becoming who one truly is. This means ceasing to live solely by the ego and the persona, to also integrate the shadow and thus draw closer to the self. When we think of self-love, this vision is revolutionary. Because solid self-love isn't born from positive reflections in the mirror or pre-packaged self-help phrases. It's the love that arises when a person recognizes and embraces their contradictions, accepts their flaws, and at the same time, honors their potential. The fragility of external self-esteem begins to weaken when we embark on this path. Individuation shows us that we don't need to rely on applause to feel worthy. A person who loves themselves deeply may even receive criticism, but it doesn't destroy them. They're like a tree with deep roots. The wind shakes it, but it doesn't uproot it. This doesn't mean becoming unshakable or perfect, but rather real. Spirituality here isn't about escape, but about the courage to look at oneself with brutal honesty. In practice, an initial step toward building this solid self-love is to begin recognizing repeated patterns of pain. What situations make you constantly doubt yourself? Which people have the power to destabilize you? Noting these contexts is like mapping the shadow terrain. Once identified, you can use shadow work to illuminate these points. Reading Jung's Man and His Symbols can shed light on this process, as can practicing small daily actions that honor your truth, like saying no when your ego would like to please. And it's precisely when this inner root begins to grow that we realize how relationships also reveal and test the quality of our self-esteem. Relationships are perhaps the most obvious arena where self-esteem is revealed. Carl Jung said that the other acts as a mirror. It shows not only what is beautiful in us, but also what we still reject in ourselves. When someone enters into a relationship with a fragile ego, the tendency is to seek constant validation. The persona feigns strength, but deep down there is a fear of abandonment. This creates bonds of dependence, where love is not an exchange, but a necessity. And inevitably, when the other fails to offer security, self-esteem collapses. Healthy relationships are only possible when there is solid self-love. Without it, any disagreement becomes proof of rejection. It's like expecting the other person to be responsible for holding what we ourselves cannot. Jung explained that this dynamic arises from projection. We place the burden of carrying our shadow and fulfilling our needs on our partner, but no one can bear this burden for long. As spirituality deepens, we learn that true love only blossoms when born of completeness, not lack. In practice, it's possible to observe the quality of one's self-esteem by how we react in relationships. If common criticisms become personal attacks, if compliments are the only source of confidence, or if loneliness is unbearable, this points to internal gaps. A useful exercise is to reflect, would I be at peace with myself if I were alone? This simple question reveals how deeply self-love is built, and it is from this clarity that we can take the next step, understanding how to apply concrete Jungian principles to strengthen self-love in any circumstance. Carl Jung didn't speak of self-love as an abstract concept, but as the fruit of a practical and profound process. The first step is to recognize one's shadow. There's no point in repeating self-esteem mantras while avoiding the aspects that cause shame. The ego tries to hide flaws, the persona tries to disguise them with charm or performance, but only when we face our flaws head-on does a solid foundation emerge. Shadow work is essential here. Writing about triggers, analyzing behavior patterns, even seeking analytical therapy. It's painful, but necessary. The second step is learning to differentiate between essence and mask. Many people get confused, believing that they are merely the roles they play. The good professional, the attentive partner, the trustworthy friend. These social archetypes are useful, but they are not the whole. True self-love requires the courage to take off the mask and ask yourself, who am I when I'm not playing any role? This contact with the self, however brief, is more empowering than any external applause. A third practical step is to cultivate personal symbols that reinforce this connection. Jung saw dreams and myths as a bridge to the unconscious. Creating simple rituals, such as keeping a dream journal, drawing symbols that appear repeatedly, or meditating on archetypal images, can be a way to integrate fragments of the psyche. Furthermore, small daily actions, such as respecting boundaries, saying no when necessary, and honoring one's own truth, are concrete expressions of this self-love under construction. And as this process deepens, a common question arises: how to distinguish true self-love from the narcissism that the ego often tries to sell as a substitute. One of the greatest misconceptions of our time is the belief that self-love and narcissism are the same thing. Carl Jung warned that when the ego takes over, it can hijack even the noblest concepts. Narcissism arises from an inflated persona, that mask that needs to be admired, recognized, and feared. Self-love, on the other hand, springs from inner spirituality, from the integration of the shadow, and from reconciliation with one's own archetypes. While the narcissist places themselves at the center of the world, those with self-love understand that they are merely part of a greater whole without losing their sense of dignity. The practical difference is clear. Narcissism demands an audience. Self-love survives in silence. The narcissist only exists when someone is watching. The self-loving person remains steadfast, even in solitude. A simple example: someone with narcissism posts a photo to be validated. Someone with self-love posts or doesn't post because their identity doesn't depend on others' reactions. This distinction may seem subtle, but in everyday life it changes everything. It's the difference between living as a slave to the outside world or free to act authentically. It's worth reflecting. When you make decisions, are you seeking applause or honoring your truth? This is a direct criterion for understanding where your self-esteem lies. Books like Naomi Wolf's The Beauty Myth or Jung's Memories, Dreams, Reflections help us see how culture fosters masks that confuse narcissism with self-love. And it's precisely when we recognize this difference that another delicate point emerges: how to deal with the inferiority complex and constant comparison that the ego insists on provoking. Few things erode self-esteem as much as comparison. Carl Jung explained that an inferiority complex arises when the ego, instead of reconciling with its uniqueness, insists on measuring itself by the yardstick of others. It's as if each achievement of others were a silent accusation against what we cannot be. To avoid feeling defeated, the persona dons masks, feigning self-confidence, flaunting achievements, seeking attention. But deep down, emptiness remains. Spirituality shows that comparison is an illusion because each trajectory is shaped by unique archetypes. And trying to live someone else's life is denying one's own individuation. In practice, this complex manifests itself in everyday situations. When opening social media and feeling envious of others' perfect lives, when undervaluing oneself at work because someone else gets more recognition, or when believing one only deserves love if one achieves a certain physical standard. These are all reflections of a mind trapped in external perspective. Shadow work can be a powerful tool here. Instead of repressing the discomfort, the person can write, "What exactly bothers me about this comparison? What does this reveal about my unaccepting shadow?" This exercise, when repeated, transforms envy into self-awareness. One path to liberation is learning to transform comparison into inspiration. Instead of viewing others as rivals, see them as a mirror that points to dormant potential. If someone feels inferior because a colleague speaks well in public, this can be an invitation to develop their own voice, not a reason for shame. Jung would say that every poorly digested comparison is a projection waiting to be integrated. And by integrating, the inferiority complex gradually dissolves. But to do so, it is necessary to face another challenge: loneliness as an inevitable part of the individuation process. Loneliness is often seen as punishment, but Carl Jung understood it as an inevitable stage of individuation. When an individual begins to detach themselves from their persona and delve into shadow work, they realize that not everyone will accompany them on this path. Friendships can dissolve, relationships can be shaken, because the process of becoming who they truly are doesn't always fit the molds others have projected. Spirituality teaches that this silent journey isn't definitive isolation, but preparation, a space where the ego stops relying on the audience and learns to sustain itself in the presence of the self. In practice, this period can manifest itself on days when silence weighs more heavily than the presence of anyone. It's that moment when the mind questions, "Have I gone mad choosing this path?" But paradoxically, it is in this solitude that deeper answers are found. A powerful exercise is to use this time to record dreams, meditate on symbols, and even revisit works that speak of the inner journey, such as Jung's memoirs, Dreams, Reflections, or Khalil Gibran's The Prophet. These texts offer the sense that solitude is not abandonment, but invisible companionship. The curious thing is that the more solitude is embraced, the more it transforms into a source of strength. It is in solitude that one discovers that no one's presence can replace one's own wholeness, and precisely for this reason, it prepares one for truer connections in the future. Individuation doesn't kill the desire for connection, but rather purifies it. It teaches that being with someone only makes sense when one is not bound by need. This awareness opens the way to another fundamental territory in the process of self-love: the symbolic world of dreams and the unconscious. Carl Jung believed that the unconscious speaks through symbols, and that dreams are its most direct language. For him, denying this dialogue is like living in a house full of closed doors, never daring to open them. Solid self-love is strengthened when we learn to decipher these signs, because they show us not only what we hide, but also what we can become. A dream in which the ego is defeated can, for example, reveal the need to abandon a worn-out persona. Recurring symbols, such as water, fire, or mirrors, are invitations to delve into archetypes that demand integration. In practice, keeping a dream journal is a simple yet transformative exercise. By writing down dream images as soon as you wake up, you begin to notice patterns and repetitions. This becomes valuable material for shadow work, because every detail is a clue from the psyche trying to communicate. Imagine someone who always dreams of running away from crowds. Perhaps the unconscious is telling them that their social persona is suffocating their true self. This interpretation isn't a rule, but an invitation to reflect. Most importantly, symbols don't lie. They reveal truths that the ego tries to hide. Beyond dreams, symbols also appear in everyday synchronicities. Repeatedly encountering the same word, animal, or number may seem random, but Jung saw it as the living language of the collective unconscious. These signs reinforce that spirituality is not something distant, but a pulsating reality. And the more we learn to listen to this language, the more capable we become of protecting our inner space. Because there's no point in building self-love if there aren't also clear boundaries against the so-called psychic vampires that drain energy and self-esteem. Carl Jung observed that a vulnerable ego seeks excessive approval and therefore ends up allowing constant invasions. People without clear boundaries become easy targets for what we now call psychic vampires. Individuals who drain emotional energy, manipulate others' personalities, and feed on their fragility. This is where the importance of building a symbolic fortress of boundaries comes in. Self-love isn't just about internal affection, it's also about the ability to say no when shadow work reveals that a situation compromises one's own integrity. In practice, boundaries are expressed in small daily actions. For example, not immediately responding to messages that invade your resting space, not accepting invitations simply for fear of displeasing, or even staying away from environments that reinforce harmful archetypes of comparison. This isn't selfishness, it's self-care. Jung would say that every time we protect our energy, we strengthen our connection with the self, while the ego becomes less dependent on validation. Spirituality here translates into simple yet powerful actions that prevent dignity from being drained. It's curious to note how society often romanticizes the absence of limits, calling them kindness or altruism. But without healthy boundaries, individuation is impossible. Solid self-love requires this act of courage, making it clear how far others can go and where one's own territory begins. Only then can one walk wholeheartedly, without living with compromises that corrode oneself. And when this inner strength is built, the view of self-love changes. It ceases to be an end goal and becomes an ongoing journey, full of discoveries and transformations. One of the greatest modern misconceptions is that self-love is a fixed point to be achieved, like a trophy kept on a shelf. Carl Jung reminded us that the process of individuation never ends because the psyche is in constant flux. Likewise, self-love is not a destination, but a daily spiritual journey. It's like rowing against the current. If you stop, The ego takes over again, the persona resumes its pretense, and the shadow manifests unconsciously. Therefore, loving yourself is a living exercise, made of repeated choices. This journey includes ups and downs. There will be days when self-esteem seems solid, and others when external criticism suddenly knocks it down. But this doesn't mean failure. It means humanity. True self-love doesn't eliminate pain, but it teaches us to navigate it with dignity. With each fall, the archetype of the inner hero calls us to rise stronger. Spirituality here isn't perfection, but resilience. One learns to laugh at stumbles, to embrace oneself when they make mistakes, to celebrate small victories without relying on external applause. In practice, it's helpful to create habits that remind us of this path daily. Keeping a reflection journal, revisiting recorded dreams, practicing meditation, reading authors like Jung or Clarissa Pinkola Estes, and even cultivating moments of silence. These are rituals that remind us that self-love is a constant process of construction. This perspective changes everything because it frees us from the rush to get there and offers the serenity to keep walking. And it's at this point that deeper awareness emerges, realizing that this silent journey isn't just about self-esteem, but about an inner revolution that changes the way we experience the world. Ultimately, Carl Jung teaches us that self-love is not a modern luxury, but a revolutionary act. When someone stops living solely by the ego and the persona, when they courageously integrate the shadow and discover the power of the archetypes that inhabit them, a silent shift occurs. The individual no longer needs to beg for respect because they treat themselves with dignity. This inner revolution transforms not only the way they relate to themselves, but also to the world. Spirituality ceases to be a distant theory and becomes a practice embodied in every gesture, in every choice. Solid self-love is like an inner fire. It doesn't depend on external wind to keep it burning. It guides, illuminates, and protects. It is in this state that a person learns to say yes to what strengthens and no to what destroys without fear of disapproval. It is also there that they realize that self-esteem is not vanity, but the foundation of individuation, the journey of becoming whole. Jung showed that only those who immerse themselves in this process can truly offer authentic love to others, because they are no longer giving from a place of need, but from completeness. And perhaps this is the greatest calling. Understanding that self-love is not a final destination, but an endless trail of discovery. With each step, symbols, dreams, and encounters reinforce the journey. With each fall, the shadow brings lessons. With each victory, the self shines brighter. It's a revolution that needs no applause, because it has already transformed the inner stage. Those who awaken to this journey discover that there is no greater power than carrying within themselves a love that no one can break. In the end, the great lesson is simple yet rare. Self-love is not a gift someone gives you. It's an inner work that no one can take away. Carl Jung showed us that true spirituality is not an escape, but the courage to look at the ego without disguise, to accept the persona as a role, to integrate the shadow as a teacher, and to walk toward the self with dignity. This process doesn't happen overnight, but each step changes everything. Ask yourself now, how many times have you given up your peace to please someone else? How many times have you let your life be guided by comparison, fear, or the need for approval? How long will you allow your self-esteem to depend on outside eyes? It's uncomfortable to admit, but only from this honesty comes the strength that no one can break. True self-love isn't shouted. It's demonstrated silently in the way you treat yourself, respect yourself, and support yourself even when the world turns its back. So, the choice is before you. Continue repeating old patterns or begin the inner revolution that changes everything. If this content awakened something within you, let me know in the comments. Sometimes the first word is the first step toward transformation. And if you want to continue receiving profound reflections on Carl Jung, spirituality, ego, persona, shadow work, and archetypes, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Your journey doesn't end here. It's just beginning.